My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Old Testament prophets and kings, and scheming scoundrels too, collected in this book, Exile of the Chosen, God's Heroes from Solomon to Malachi. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended.
Chapter 4, Part 1, Zilla. "Are we really at war with Syria?" Zilla asked her father anxiously. Jedediah paused and looked at his 11-year-old daughter. "Yes, but where did you hear that?" "I just hear things," she replied haltingly. "Yes, that you do," he laughed. "You have big eyes and ears and a small mouth, which is very wise when you live in a king's court like this." He put his arm around her. "Don't look so worried, Zilla. Our Lord will take care of us. The God of Israel is stronger than any of the gods of other nations." "Yes," Zilla said slowly, "but sometimes he allows people to get hurt." Her father sighed. "Yes, sometimes he does. But you can never go wrong trusting him. You'll be a whole lot better off than trusting anyone else, no matter what anyone in the palace says." The girl understood that the king and queen had not always followed the God of Israel. She had heard of terrible things that had happened before her birth. Lately, Ahab had repented and was trying to obey the God of Israel. However, the queen was determined never to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Ahab was finding old habits dying rather hard. I continued my duties as a celestial watcher of young people. I was now observing young Zilla, just as I had been assigned to her father Jedediah before her. Her grandfather Obadiah was still greatly honored in the king's court, but spent most of his time away from the city, on his farm. Jedediah now performed many of the administrative tasks in the palace that Obadiah had once fulfilled. Zilla's father traveled back and forth between Ahab and Obadiah because the king still relied on Obadiah for advice and counsel, particularly in serious times such as these. "Well, as long as you've been listening to everything else," Jedediah told his daughter, "then you'll soon hear this. King Jehoshaphat of Judah is coming here to Israel." "Is he at war with us too?" Zilla asked in alarm. "No," her father replied. "He's coming to make an alliance with King Ahab, and we're going to fight the Syrians together." The girl smiled. "That's good, isn't it? King Jehoshaphat is a follower of the God of Israel." "Yes, though he probably considers him the God of Judah." "Israel, Judah," Zilla mumbled. "What if we just called him God?" "That could work, I suppose." He studied her, then touched her cheek. "So, don't be afraid, but do keep your eyes and ears open, for these will be interesting times." I nodded. They certainly would be. Zilla stood behind the lattice work, concealing the balcony of the royal throne room. The queen and others used it when they wished to know what was going on in court without actually having to enter where they might not be welcome. King Ahab and King Jehoshaphat had gone through the usual royal greetings, feasting, and giving of gifts. Finally, they were getting down to the purpose of their meeting. "Your Majesty," King Ahab said, turning to King Jehoshaphat of Judah, "when we go to battle against the Syrians, will you accompany us?" Jehoshaphat nodded. "Yes, as you go, we too will go and be part of your people, and those who are at war with you will be at war with us." "Good. Now we need to get down to serious planning. I've arranged for some prophets to advise on when and where to attack." "Excellent! So many prophets of God?" he asked in amazement as the 400 prophets filed into the chamber. "Well, of local gods," Ahab explained. "You know Israel. Not many people worship the old God of Abraham, so I've tried to get prophets of local gods from the villages and places that people are familiar with." King Jehoshaphat's face creased with concern. Zilla frowned to herself. King Ahab had been trying to follow the God of Israel since his recent encounter with Elijah on Mount Carmel. What was he thinking? The prophets, to a person, all said, "Go, for God will deliver our enemies into the king's hands. We should be victorious." When they were finished, Jehoshaphat turned to Ahab. Don't you even have one prophet of the Lord here that we might talk to?" Ahab looked around. Where was Elijah when he needed him? There was, however, another less well-known prophet. The king turned to the Judahite king. "There is one. His name is Micaiah, but he has never prophesied one good thing for me. And every time I bring him into the court, not only does he prophesy against me, but he generally embarrasses me as well in front of everyone." "Oh, no," Jehoshaphat protested. "I'm sure he won't do that this time. If he's truly a prophet of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then whatever he tells us we need to hear. I'd be much more comfortable making our plans after listening to what he has to say." Ahab squirmed in his chair. "Just as a favor to you, Jehoshaphat," he said, turning to one of his officers. "Quickly, fetch Micaiah, the son of Imlah." The officer bowed and disappeared from the throne room. "Meanwhile," Ahab said, "let's hear a little more what these other prophets have to say. This one's name is Zedekiah. He prophesies for me quite often." Zedekiah stepped forward. Zilla gazed at him silently. What on earth was on top of his head? It looked like a helmet with huge iron horns sticking out of it.
"Thus declares the Lord," the prophet boomed in a loud voice. "With these ram horns you shall gore the Syrians until you have destroyed them."
Prophet after prophet stepped forward, each saying,
"Go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hands of the king."
Zilla shook her head. She felt relieved that King Jehoshaphat had asked for a prophet of the Lord and that they had sent for Micaiah, but it bothered her that the other prophets were claiming to speak for the true God. Would King Jehoshaphat be able to tell the difference? It seemed like forever before the soldier that had been sent to find Micaiah returned. He thrust the prophet before the king and hissed in his ear,
"Look, Micaiah, all the other prophets have already agreed that he should go to war against Syria. So think carefully about what you say. Encourage the king."
The prophet stared at him.
"As long as the Lord lives, I'm going to have to say whatever God tells me to."
Ahab motioned to Micaiah. The prophet frowned as he stood before the thrones, where both kings could see him, as well as all the people. "Micaiah," Ahab began, "should we go to battle at Ramoth Gilead, or should we stay here?" The prophet looked Ahab in the eye.
"Go and prosper."
Ahab's face contorted into a thundercloud as he bellowed, "How many times do I have to tell you not to say anything to me except what the Lord actually told you?" Micaiah sighed.
"I saw Israel scattered all over the mountain like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord told me they have no master. Each one of them will return to their home in peace, but without their king."
Ahab turned purple with fury and turned to his fellow king.
"Jehoshaphat, didn't I tell you that he would say nothing good to me? He always does this."
"I'll tell you more,"
Micaiah continued.
"I had a vision and saw the Lord sitting upon his throne, and all the hosts of heaven were standing either to his right or to his left. And the Lord said, 'Who will entice Ahab, king of Israel, so that he will go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?' Several beings made suggestions, and then one spirit stood before the Lord and said, 'I will entice him.' And the Lord asked, 'How will you do that?' And he said, 'I will go be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets.' And the Lord said, 'That will work. You'll be successful. Go and do just that.' This is what has happened, O king. And the Lord put a lying spirit in the mouths of your prophets. It's your choice whether to believe them or not."
As soon as he finished, Zedekiah, the prophet with the horned helmet, slapped him across the face and said,
"So, which way did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you? I thought he was still with me."
"You'll see on that day,"
Micaiah replied calmly.
"You'll go into an inner chamber to hide."
Ahab, trembling with anger, shouted, "God, seize Micaiah! Take him back to Anon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, my son. Tell them I said to put this fellow in prison, and feed him with only the worst of prison food until I return in peace."
"If you return in peace, then truly the Lord didn't speak through me," the prophet countered. "Pay attention, everyone.
Then several guards hauled him off to jail. Zillah shook her head. Grandfather Obadiah had told her that Micaiah was a true prophet of God, so she believed whatever he said would happen. If he was supposed to stay in jail until the king came home in peace, he would be there a long time. She stared at King Ahab. If he went to war at Ramoth Gilead the way he was planning, would they ever see him again? It made the back of her neck prickle. Why didn't he listen? I shook my head in frustration. I couldn't understand why either. Some humans seemed so foolish, even those who tried to worship the Mighty One. It amazed me that so many could ignore a message so clear. Zilla watched her mother pace back and forth in front of the open window. Grandfather Obadiah looked up from his couch.
No sign of a messenger yet?
No, not yet, the girl's mother said, then resumed her pacing.
The Lord is able to protect them,
Grandfather Obadiah commented quietly.
And should he not, he's still able to care for you.
Mother nodded. I know that in my head, but this knot in my stomach just won't go away. Grandfather Obadiah smiled.
I understand. Sometimes our stomachs don't trust the God of Israel nearly as well as our minds do. I've had that problem myself.
Zilla looked up. Grandfather, what will happen if King Ahab gets killed in battle? He patted her on the head.
You don't need to worry about that. You will be fine whether he dies or not. But if our king perishes in battle, then Prince Ahaziah will be the next king.
I understand that, but if King Ahab does die in battle, then he won't be there to protect us from Queen Jezebel anymore. I think she's still furious at us from way back in the days of Mount Carmel. Obadiah laughed.
Yes, I imagine she is, and probably always will be. But there will always be conflicts between good and evil, and between the people who have chosen the good side and those who have gone to the evil side. Even if Ahab and Jezebel were both gone, there would still be others on both sides.
That's true, she sighed.
Besides,
Grandfather reminded her,
your father and Prince Ahaziah grew up together. And though Prince Ahaziah does not worship the God of Israel, he is good friends with your father. I don't think the queen will be any danger to you. And until they all come back from the battlefield, you're here in my home and not in the palace.
She sighed again. That's why I was able to ask those questions. Obadiah smiled.
Your father has trained you to be very wise. Always ask questions only when you are in a safe place and with safe people.
Zilla knew that in the palace the walls seemed to have ears, and anything said there quickly made its way to those being talked about. One had to be very careful. The many lattices in the palace made it easy for the king's spies to observe unnoticed and eavesdrop on many conversations. The king had to have them for his own security, for enemies lurked even inside the palace. Look, Zilla's mother shouted, someone is coming. The girl and her grandfather rushed to the window. They saw a rider in a small cloud of dust heading for them. Oh, thank you, Lord, Mother said. Any news is better than this not knowing. And even though I know God can take care of our family, the prophet Micaiah did say that the king would be killed in battle. And with Jedediah being so close to the king, she twisted her handkerchief into a knot.
Let's go down to the courtyard to greet him,
Grandfather suggested. He summoned the servants to prepare refreshments for the approaching messenger. The courier rode into the courtyard and slipped from his horse. Dropping to his knees before Obadiah, he announced, The king is dead. Long live King Ahaziah. There was silence in the courtyard. So the prophet Micaiah had been right.
What happened?
Grandfather Obadiah asked. The Syrians ordered their soldiers to go just for the king of Israel. They knew that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was fighting with him, and they should ignore him, but kill Ahab. Ahab disguised himself as a common soldier, so only King Jehoshaphat was in the royal chariot. The Syrians surrounded it, and Jehoshaphat called out to the God of Abraham for help. and that was a sure sign to the Syrians that it wasn't Ahab, and they quickly guessed what had happened. So the battle continued. Even though Ahab was disguised, he was wounded. An arrow pierced his shoulder between the pieces of armor. He had himself propped up in the back of his chariot, but he died toward evening from the loss of blood. Prince Ahaziah was also disguised and escaped unscathed. He'll be returning this evening.
And Jedediah?
Mother asked. He'll be returning with Ahaziah, the messenger replied. Your husband is well.
Oh, praise the God of Abraham,
Zillah's mother whispered. While she was thankful that her father was safe, the coming changes at the palace made Zillah nervous. Things would be different, and it would take a little while to get used to them. As if reading her thoughts, Grandfather asked her,
Zilla, would you like to stay here for a while at my farm? There's no reason for you to go back to the palace right now. Princess Athaliah was recently married off to Jehoshaphat's son, so you have no specific duties there, and I would enjoy your company here.
The girl looked at her mother for permission. Mother nodded.
I would love to, Grandfather.
Good. I will mention it to your father when he returns.
I was pleased. The palace was not a good place for a young person at the best of times, and the power struggles and political intrigue during a change of rulers made the royal court a dangerous place. I glanced at Zillah's guardian. He seemed pleased too. While Ahab was an evil king, our expectations of his son Ahaziah were not much better. Zillah stared out the window and stretched. Her back was starting to ache from sitting at the loom too long, but she enjoyed weaving. Grandmother had taught her how since she had come to live with her and Grandfather Obadiah. It was something that most young women in Israel learned to do much earlier, but Zillah, having lived in the palace all her life, had missed some experiences. She bent over the section of completed cloth, fingering the design. Grandmother had given her a skein of the expensive blue wool, and she had woven it into the fabric in narrow stripes near the beginning. Later she would put in matching stripes near the end. Zillah was making a new prayer shawl for her grandfather.
Someday, Grandmother announced, these men of ours are going to find you a husband, and when they do, you'll be glad you've learned how to do this.
Zillah, however, was not in any rush for her father and grandfather to get her a husband. She was much happier living with her grandparents. Her stay with them had extended almost 2 years, but so much was going on at the palace that Grandfather Obadiah's farm seemed a better place to be. She heard that Jehoshaphat and King Ahaziah had also formed an alliance, and they had been fighting against Moab. It always made her nervous when Israel went into battle against the Moabites, for she knew her father was with King Ahaziah. Grandfather Obadiah was always especially comforting during those times. During one battle, things had looked particularly grim. Then the Lord had sent rain, and all the ruts and trenches in the battlefield turned into water troughs and ponds. When the sun came up in the morning, the reflection on the water was bright red. The Moabites mistook it for blood and fled.
Why?
Zillah asked her grandfather.
Why would God help our military with such a wonderful miracle when our king doesn't even worship him?
Ah, Obadiah replied, while our king doesn't worship him, many of his subjects do. And because we have an alliance with King Jehoshaphat, perhaps the Lord was honoring Judah's king and his faith. Or perhaps,
he put his arm around her,
perhaps the Lord did it because he loves your father and was protecting him. The Lord is very merciful, even when we have leaders who don't always follow him. However, such leaders always hurt the country in the long run.
Does that mean that while the Lord defends our kingdom, he may not protect the king?
Only God knows what his plans are, but if I were the king, and I were not loyal to God, I would not expect his personal protection, would you?
Zillah glanced around by force of habit, and then remembered at Grandfather's house she could speak freely. She shook her head.
No, but after the God of Abraham made things so clear to everyone so many times, I don't know why anyone would not follow him.
I don't know either. But when our leaders choose not to obey God, it does make it dangerous for those who do.
A sober expression crossed her face.
I know. At the palace, we always had to be so careful what we said.
It was like that when I served King Ahab there too.
Zillah's forehead creased into a frown. It's so hard to know what God expects us to do. We worship Him, but never speak of Him when anyone is around. Is that what He wants? What if He wants us to speak out and be brave? How can we tell? Elijah always did, but our family has always been very careful not to say anything when we were unsure of the beliefs of those around us. Grandfather Obadiah shifted his weight and rubbed his swollen knuckles for several minutes before he answered. I don't know, Zilla, he finally said. Working in the palace, I struggled with that issue all my life. Sometimes I felt like such a coward. Yet other times I felt as if the only way I was able to do what God wanted me to do and help His people was by maintaining the important position I had. Are the rules different for each people? She asked. Does God want some people to speak out and others to keep silent? I don't know. I've prayed to Him many times about that. And yet, during my years, it seemed that keeping silent was the way to do the most good. Because of it, I was able to protect God's prophets from Jezebel during the drought. I do believe that is what the God of Abraham wanted me to do at the time, but each person will have to pray and consider that for themselves. My father believes the same as you, Zilla said. Yes, he does. However, you, my dear granddaughter, will have to pray and make your own decisions as you go along. The girl returned to her weaving. I knew that the Mighty One had great plans for this youngster, and it was important for her to think about such things. And yet she was so young, only in her 13th year. If anyone had told her that the Mighty One was going to use her to bring about major religious and political changes in her world, she would have laughed. However, those of us familiar with the way the Mighty One works would have known that is His way. He often uses the young, the old, and the weak. Because of their weakness, it becomes very obvious where the power and strength really lies, and it brings honor to Him.
This broadcast has come from the book Exile of the Chosen by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.